Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment. What happens when one of cinema's most disciplined, most intense performers sits across from one of Hollywood's most controversial political voices, and a simple promotional interview transforms into the most devastating takedown in daytime television history? What you're about to witness isn't just a celebrity disagreement. This is the moment. Tom Cruise systematically dismantled Jane Fonda's carefully constructed image, exposing decades of unresolved hypocrisy in under 20 minutes of live television. This is a story of how a routine publicity stop became an unforgettable war of words. This is a moment that proves some wounds never truly heal, and some truths can't stay buried forever. And this is a confrontation that left one of Hollywood's most outspoken activists completely speechless, humiliated before millions of viewers who watched in stunned silence as her defenses crumbled like paper in a hurricane. The morning began ordinarily enough at the View Studios in New York City. Production assistants moved through their familiar routines, adjusting lighting arrays and testing sound levels with practiced efficiency. Makeup artists put final touches on host appearances, while stage managers confirmed timing and segment transitions. The audience filed in with the usual buzz of anticipation, their excitement heightened by the knowledge that Tom Cruise himself will be gracing the stage. Tom Cruise. The name alone carried weight. Decades of box office dominance, jaw-dropping stunts performed without doubles, an intensity and commitment to his craft that had become legendary in an industry full of pretenders. When his publicist had confirmed his appearance to promote his latest action thriller, the producers had practically celebrated. This was guaranteed ratings gold. What they didn't know, what nobody could predicted, was that Jane Fonda was in a particularly combative mood that morning. When Tom finally made his entrance, the studio erupted in applause. He moved with that characteristic energy, that coiled spring intensity that never seemed to diminish despite the decades. His smile was genuine and warm as he waved to the audience, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. He looked sharp in a perfectly tailored suit, every inch the movie star, radiating confidence and charisma. Whoopi Goldberg rose to greet him with genuine warmth, shaking his hand firmly and gesturing to the seat they prepared. The other hosts smiled welcomingly, all except Jane Fonda, who sat back in her chair with an expression that was harder to read. Her smile was there, technically speaking, but it carried an edge. Those who knew her well, who had worked with her over the years, might have recognized that look. It was the expression of someone preparing for battle. "Tom Cruise, welcome to The View," Whoopi announced with obvious delight. "It's always such a pleasure to have you here with us." "Thank you so much for having me," Tom replied, that trademark intensity evident even in his greeting. "I'm always happy to be here with you all. This show has such amazing energy." Whoopi eased into the interview with practice skill, asking about the new film, the preparation, the training regimen he'd undertaken. Tom lit up as he talked about the project, leaning forward with that laser focus that made him such a compelling presence both on SCRN and off. "The thing about this character," he said, his eyes blazing with passion, "is that he represents something real. He's someone who doesn't back down from what's right, no matter what the personal cost might be. That's what drew me to this role, that sense of absolute commitment to principles." The words had barely left his mouth when Jane Fonda made her move. She had been sitting there throughout the opening pleasantries with a slight smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, clearly waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now she leaned forward, her voice carrying a tone of condescension that was impossible to miss. "That's interesting, Tom," she interrupted, cutting across Whoopi's follow-up question. "Because I have to wonder about someone who talks so much about what's right when they're part of an organization that has such a questionable track record with transparency and truthfulness." The temperature in the studio dropped instantly. The audience fell silent, the easy warmth of moments before evaporating like water on hot pavement. Camera operators exchanged quick glances, recognizing that something significant was about to unfold. Tom's expression shifted. That friendly promotional smile flickered just for a second, just long enough for those watching closely to notice before he composed himself. But anyone who truly knew Tom Cruise, anyone familiar with his work and his intensity, recognized that particular look in his eyes. Things were about to get very real. Very quickly, Whoopi tried to jump in. her host instincts kicking in to redirect before this derailed completely. "Well, let's talk about the incredible action sequences in the film," she said, her voice carrying a forced brightness. "I understand you did all your own." "No, I think this is important," Jane interrupted, her self-righteous tone growing stronger, more assured. "I think we need to have this conversation. Here we have someone who presents himself as this all-American hero on screen, but in real life he's deeply involved with an organization that former members have described as controlling, manipulative, even dangerous. Don't you think the public deserves some honesty about that, Tom? Don't you think they deserve the truth?" The studio audience was completely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wishing they were anywhere else on the planet. Joy Behar looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Even Whoopi, normally unflappable, appeared genuinely concerned about where this was heading. But Tom Cruise didn't lose his composure. Instead, he did something that caught everyone completely off guard. Something that would set the tone for everything that followed. He started laughing. Not a nervous laugh or a defensive chuckle designed to deflect uncomfortable questions. This was a genuine laugh, deep and almost amused, as if Jane had just told the most absurd joke he'd heard in years. The sound echoed through the tent studio, completely at odds with the atmosphere. "Jane," he said, shaking his head slowly, and there was something almost like pity in his expression. "I have to say, this is probably the most hypocritical thing I've heard in a very, very long time." Jane's confident expression faltered slightly. This clearly wasn't the response she'd been expecting. She'd come loaded for battle, ready for defensiveness, anger, perhaps some stuttering attempts at justification. Laughter and accusations of hypocrisy weren't part of her script. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising an octave, surprise evident in her tone. Tom's demeanor was shifting now, that Hollywood charm beginning to peel away to reveal something harder underneath, something more dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice was steady but carried an edge that was becoming more apparent with each word. "You want to talk about questionable organizations and transparency?" he said, leaning forward slightly. "You want to talk about people who present themselves as one thing while being something completely different behind the scenes?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment before delivering the blow. "Jane, you literally traveled to North Vietnam during a war where American soldiers were dying. You posed for propaganda photographs with the enemy. You gave aid and comfort to people who were holding American prisoners of war." And now his voice carried a note of genuine disbelief. "Now you want to sit here and lecture me about patriotism, about honesty, about transparency." The studio erupted into uncomfortable murmurs. Several audience members gasped audibly. Jane's face went pale, then flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again like someone searching desperately for words that wouldn't come. That was a different time. She finally managed to stammer. Her earlier confidence completely shattered. That was about trying to end a senseless war that was killing people. "A different time," Tom repeated slowly, his intensity ramping up in that way that makes his performances so captivating, so impossible to look away from. "Jane, those weren't just statistics in a newspaper. Those were real people, real families who lost sons and daughters and brothers and fathers while you were providing comfort to the people shooting at them." He leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "And you want to question my character?" Joy Behar tried desperately to intervene, her voice weak and uncertain. "Maybe we should all just take a step back here," she suggested, looking around at the other hosts for support. "Maybe we can." But the train had already left the station, picking up speed with every passing second, and there was no stopping it now. Jane Fonda, clearly feeling cornered, did what cornered animals often do. She attacked harder. "At least I had the courage to stand up for what I believed in." She shot back, her voice getting sharper, more desperate. "At least I wasn't hiding behind some cult-like organization that controls every aspect of my life and tells me what to think and how to act." That was the moment everything changed. Tom Cruise's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. The Hollywood charm, the promotional smile, the friendly movie star persona, all of it vanished like smoke. What emerged in its place was something much more intense, much more dangerous. This wasn't a smooth media-trained celebrity anymore. This was someone who had just been pushed too far, and everyone in the studio could feel the shift. Cult-like organization, he repeated slowly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. And somehow that whisper was more terrifying than any shout could have been. The studio seemed to lean in collectively, straining to hear every word. Jane, let me tell you something about courage. Real courage. Not the Hollywood version, not the publicity stunt version, but actual courage. He paused and the silence was suffocating. Courage isn't flying to enemy territory for a photo opportunity that you know will get you on the front page of every newspaper in the world. Courage isn't grandstanding for the cameras, while real heroes are dying in rice paddies. Courage is taking responsibility for your actions and living with the consequences, something you apparently never learned how to do. The audience was completely frozen now. Even the camera operator seemed afraid to move, as if any sudden motion might break whatever spell was holding this moment together. This had gone from a simple promotional interview to something much more intense, much more personal, much more real than anyone had anticipated. Jane tried desperately to regain control of the situation, to wrestle back some of the moral high ground she thought she occupied just minutes ago. I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who she began, her voice shaking slightly. But Tom cut her off mid-sentence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. No, Jane, you're going to sit there and listen because for once in your life, someone is going to tell you the truth without worrying about your feelings or your reputation or your carefully constructed public image. His voice was rising now, that famous intensity building like a pressure cooker about to explode. Every eye in the studio was locked on him, captivated by the raw emotion, the unfiltered honesty pouring out. You want to talk about organizations? Fine. Let's talk about how you spent decades lecturing everyone else about morality and ethics and doing the right thing while conveniently forgetting your own mistakes, while conveniently glossing over the things you did that actually hurt real people. The words hit Jane like physical blows. You could see her recoil slightly in her chair, her confident facade cracking more with each passing second, pieces falling away to reveal something much more fragile underneath. But Tom wasn't finished. He was just getting started. You know what really bothers me about people like you, Jane? He continued, leaning forward with that laser focus that made him such a compelling actor, such a powerful presence. You think that because you apologize once or twice in some carefully crafted PR interviews that somehow magically erases the damage you did. You think that because you reinvented yourself as this feminist icon, this activist of progressive causes, everyone should just forget that you gave aid and comfort to people who were literally torturing American prisoners of war. Whoopi Goldberg made one more desperate attempt to steer the conversation elsewhere to salvage something from this disaster. Tom, maybe we could talk about your upcoming projects, she suggested, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining professionalism. I know you have some exciting things in the works. But Tom ignored her completely. His attention was laser-focused on Jane Fonda, who was now looking genuinely shaken. Her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the armrest of her chair. Her face had gone pale again. All the earlier fire and righteousness drained away. And the worst part, Tom continued relentlessly, the absolute worst part of all, of this is that you've never really owned up to what you did. Not really. You've made excuses. You've rationalized it. You've tried to reframe it as youthful idealism or political activism or whatever helps you sleep at night. But you've never just said, I was wrong. I hurt people, and I'm truly deeply sorry for the pain I caused. Jane's hands were definitely trembling now as she reached for her water glass. Her earlier bravado completely evaporated. I have apologized, she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've said many times that I regret. Regret? Tom interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like a knife through butter. You regret it? Like it was some minor social misstep? Like you accidentally wore the wrong dress to an award show? He leaned even further forward, his intensity ratcheting up another notch. Jane, do you have any idea, any concept whatsoever, what it was like for the families of those prisoners to see you smiling and laughing with their captives? Do you understand the betrayal those soldiers felt when they saw those photographs? When they realized that someone from their own country, someone famous and influential, was giving propaganda victories to the people who were torturing them. The cameras kept cutting between their faces, capturing every micro-expression, every moment of tension and emotion. Jane looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, to sink through the floor and escape this nightmare. Tom looked like he was just hitting his stride, building towards something even more devastating. "But here's what really gets me," he continued, his voice building in intensity again. "After all of that, after all the damage you caused, after all the pain you inflicted on real people and real families, you have the audacity, the sheer breathtaking audacity, to sit here and attack my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. You came in here with your talking points all prepared, ready to make me look bad on national television, ready to score cheap points with your political base." He paused, letting that sink in, letting the weight of his words settle over the studio like a heavy blanket. "You want to talk about organizations that control people. You've been controlled by your own ego and your desperate need to be seen as relevant for so long that you completely lost touch with basic human decency." Joy Behar finally found her voice, though she sounded uncertain, almost apologetic. "Tom, I think you're being a little harsh here," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of her own words. Tom turned to her with that same intense stare, and Joy actually leaned back slightly in her seat. "Joy, let me ask you something," he said, his voice deadly serious. "If someone in your family had been captured in Vietnam, and they were being tortured day after day, and they somehow managed to survive and come home broken and traumatized, how do you think they would feel about Jane's little publicity stunt? Would you tell them they were being too harsh for being angry about it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown down. Joy opened her mouth to respond, seemed to realize she didn't have a good answer, and closed it again. The silence stretched uncomfortably, thick with tension, before Tom turned back to Jane. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Jane?" His voice had softened slightly, but it had lost none of its intensity, none of its cutting edge. "You could have been a real force for good. You had a platform. You had influence. You had the ability to make a genuine difference in people's lives." He shook his head slowly, and there was something almost sad in the gesture. "But instead of using that power responsibly, you chose to become a symbol of everything that's wrong with celebrity activism. You chose personal publicity over genuine principle. You chose self-promotion over actual service." Jane finally found some of her voice again, though it was noticeably weaker, more defensive than before. "That's not fair," she protested, her words lacking conviction. "I've spent my entire life fighting for important causes. Women's rights, environmental issues, social justice. Fighting for causes," Tom repeated. And there was mockery in his voice now, bitter and cutting. "Jane, showing up at a few rallies and making speeches isn't fighting. You want to know what fighting really is?" He leaned forward again, his eyes blazing. "Fighting is what those guys were doing when they were getting shot at in the jungle, while you were posing for pictures with the people shooting at them. Fighting is what those families were doing when they kept believing, kept hoping their sons and husbands would come home, while you were giving propaganda victories to the enemy. That's fighting. What you do is performance art." The studio audience was completely captivated now, hanging on every word. This wasn't just a celebrity disagreement anymore. This was a genuine confrontation between two completely different worldviews, two completely different understandings of courage and principle and responsibility. And everyone in the room could feel the weight of it, the significance of this moment. Jane tried a different approach, attempting desperately to regain some moral high ground, to find some angle that might give her an advantage. "At least I've evolved," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "At least I've grown from my mistakes. Learn from them. Can you say the same? Are you going to sit there and tell me that your organization hasn't made any mistakes? That there aren't people who've been hurt by it?" It was a desperate move, trying to redirect the conversation back to Tom's beliefs, back to the attack she'd originally planned. But Tom was ready for it. In fact, he seemed almost pleased that she had brought it up again, as if she just handed him exactly the opening he needed. "You want to talk about evolution, Jane? Let me tell you about real evolution, about genuine growth." His voice was getting stronger, more passionate, more intense with each word. Evolution is taking responsibility for your actions without making excuses for them. Evolution is admitting when you're wrong, without trying to justify why you were wrong in the first place. Evolution is understanding that some things can't be undone, can't be taken back, and the best you can do is try to live better going forward. He was on a roll now, the words pouring out with conviction and power. But what you've done isn't evolution, it's image rehabilitation. You've spent decades trying to rewrite history, trying to make people forget what you really did. Try and position yourself as some kind of wise elder stateswoman who learned valuable lessons from her youthful mistakes. Tom shook his head firmly. But wisdom isn't about learning to spin your failures better, Jane. It's about understanding the true cost of those failures. It's about recognizing the real human damage you caused and carrying that weight with humility. Jane was looking genuinely distraught now, all her defenses stripped away. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "You don't know what it was like back then. The pressure, the confusion, the confusion." Tom shot back immediately, his voice sharp as a razor. "Jane, let me clear up any confusion for you. When your country is at war and your countrymen are dying, you don't fly to the enemy capital and pose for propaganda photographs. That's not confusing. That's not complicated. That's basic human decency. That's fundamental loyalty. That's common sense." He paused for a moment, seeming to gather himself. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow even more intense than before. The entire studio leaned in to catch every word. "You know what really bothers me about this whole conversation, Jane? It's not just what you did 50 years ago. It's how you've handled it ever since. You've made an entire career out of being the victim. Poor Jane. She was young and idealistic. Poor Jane. She was manipulated by the anti-war movement. Poor Jane. Everyone was so mean to her when she was just trying to help end a terrible war." Jane's face had gone completely white. Her lips trembled slightly as she tried to form words. "That's not," she started weakly. But Tom wasn't finished. "But here's the truth that you've never been willing to face, that you've spent decades running from. You weren't a victim in Vietnam, Jane. Those prisoners were victims. Those families waiting at home were victims. Those soldiers who came back to find out that a Hollywood actress had been giving propaganda victories to their captors. They were victims." He leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. You were just someone who made a choice and didn't want to deal with the consequences, and you've been making excuses for that choice ever since." The silence in the studio was deafening. Camera operators stood frozen at their positions, afraid that any movement might somehow break this moment. Sound engineers monitored their equipment with unusual intensity, making sure not to miss a single syllable. Everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be talked about for years. "And now," Tom continued, his voice building again like a wave gathering strength decades later, "you want to sit here and lecture me about making questionable choices? You want to question my integrity, my judgment, my beliefs?" He shook his head slowly, and there was something almost like wonder in his expression. Wonder at the sheer audacity of what Jane had attempted. "Jane, you've spent more time trying to rehabilitate your image than you ever spent actually considering the real damage you caused to real people. You become a professional victim, playing that role so well, and for so long that you convince yourself it's true. And somehow that's supposed to give you the moral authority to judge other people." Jane tried one more time to mount some kind of defense, to salvage something from this complete disaster. "I was trying to end a war that was killing people," she said desperately, her voice breaking. "I was trying to bring attention to something that was fundamentally wrong." "No," Tom said firmly, cutting her off with absolute certainty. "You were trying to get attention. Period. If you really wanted to end the war, there were 1,000 different ways to do that without giving aid and comfort to the enemy. You could have protested at home. You could have lobbied Congress. You could have used your celebrity to raise awareness without traveling to Hanoi and posing for photographs." He leaned forward again, his eyes boring into hers. "But those ways wouldn't have gotten you on the front page of every newspaper in the world, would they? They wouldn't have made you the center of the story. And that's what you really wanted to be, the star of your own political drama, regardless of who got hurt in the process. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Jane looked like she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Tears were flowing freely down her face now, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run. You want to know the difference between your choices and mine? Tom pressed on relentlessly, showing no mercy. My choices, my beliefs, my commitments, they're about trying to help people, try and make things better, try and contribute something positive to the world. Your choice in Vietnam was about making yourself the center of attention in someone else's tragedy. And that's exactly what you're trying to do here today. Whoopi made one last desperate attempt to restore some semblance of control to her show. Maybe we should all take a breath here, she suggested weakly, looking around at the other hosts for support. Maybe we need to, but Tom was in full flow now, and there was absolutely no stopping him. You know what I find most telling about this whole exchange, Jane? His voice carried a note of genuine disappointment, now mixed with the anger and intensity. You started this conversation by attacking my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. You came in here with your talking points all prepared, ready to make me look bad on national television, ready to score cheap political points. He paused, letting the moment stretch. But the instant someone turned the spotlight back on you, the moment someone asked you to account for your own actions and your own choices, you completely fell apart. Your whole righteous crusade collapsed like a house of cards. Another pause, even more devastating than the first. And that tells me everything I need to know about your character. It's easy to throw stones when you think you're standing on the moral high ground. It's a lot harder when someone reminds you that your own house is made of glass. Jane looked absolutely devastated. Her earlier confidence, that self-righteous certainty with which she'd launch her attack, was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. She seemed to shrink into her chair, unable to meet Tom's gaze, or face the cameras, or even look at the other hosts. And here's what really makes me sad about all of this, Tom continued, his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its intensity, none of its power. You could have used this moment differently, Jane. You could have acknowledged your past mistakes honestly and with genuine remorse. You could have shown some humility. You could have used your platform to actually help people instead of just attacking them, to make yourself feel morally superior. He shook his head slowly. But instead you chose to come in here and try to tear someone else down to make yourself feel better about your own failures. And that's just sad. The camera captured Jane's face in that moment, and it was painfully clear that something inside her had broken. The fight was completely gone. She looked like someone who had just realized that all her carefully constructed defenses, all her rehearsed justifications, all her decades of image rehabilitation had crumbled in a matter of minutes on live television. That's what people like you never understand, Tom said, his voice now carrying a tone of genuine disappointment mixed with pity. Real strength isn't about attacking other people to make yourself look good. Real courage isn't about tearing others down to build yourself up. Real integrity is about owning your mistakes honestly and trying to do better, not about spending decades making excuses and pointing fingers at everyone else. Joy Behar made a weak, half-hearted attempt to defend Jane, though her heart clearly wasn't in it. Jane has done a lot of good work over the years, she said, her voice uncertain. She supported important causes. Tom turned to her with that same penetrating stare that had been focused on Jane. Has she? He asked, and the question carried real weight, or has she just done a lot of work that makes her look good? Because there's a big difference, Joy. There's a fundamental difference between actually helping people and just appearing to help people for the cameras. He turned back to Jane, who was now staring at her hands in her lap, tears falling silently onto her dress. Jane, I want you to think about something. When you go home tonight, when you're alone with your thoughts, I want you to ask yourself one honest question. He paused, and the silence was absolute. In all these years, in all these interviews, in all these public appearances where you've talked about your mistakes in Vietnam and expressed your regrets, have you ever even once thought about those prisoners and their families as real people rather than just obstacles to your image rehabilitation? The question landed like a physical blow. Jane visibly flinched. her shoulders hunching as if she'd been struck. For a moment, it looked like she might actually break down completely, might dissolve into sobs right there on camera. Because that's what this is really about. Tom continued mercilessly, not giving her a moment to recover. This isn't about politics or organizations or who's right and who's wrong about the war or anything else. This is about basic human empathy. This is about understanding that your actions have consequences for real people, not just for your career or your reputation or your place in history, but for actual human beings who suffer because of the choices you made. He leaned back in his chair, his point made, his case closed. So before you come after anyone else, before you question anyone else's choices or integrity or beliefs, maybe you should spend some serious time examining your own. Maybe you should figure out whether you're actually trying to help people or just trying to make yourself feel better about the things you've done wrong. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Jane sat there completely defeated, unable to respond, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at her hands and let the tears fall. The other hosts looked around desperately, clearly hoping someone else would figure out how to end this nightmare, how to recover from this complete disaster. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, Whoopi found her voice. She cleared her throat and looked directly into the camera, her professional mask barely concealing her distress. "Well," she said, her tone strained and unnatural, "this has certainly been an interesting conversation. Tom, thank you for being here with us today." But Tom Cruise wasn't quite done. He had one more thing to say, one final blow to deliver. He looked directly into the camera with that intensity that had made him one of the biggest movie stars in the world, speaking not to the hosts, but to the millions of viewers watching at home. "The truth is, people can attack my beliefs, my choices, my lifestyle all they want. That's their right. But at the end of the day, I can sleep at night knowing that I've never betrayed my country. I've never given aid and comfort to enemies who are torturing American prisoners. And I've never spent decades making excuses for inexcusable behavior." He paused, letting that sink in. And I think that's a pretty good place to start any conversation about integrity or character or doing the right thing. With that, he stood up smoothly, shook Whoopi's hand with perfect politeness, nodded respectfully to the other hosts, and walked off the set with his head held high, leaving behind what was quite possibly the most uncomfortable, most devastating moment in daytime television history. Jane Fonda sat there for a few more seconds, still staring at her hands, tears continuing to fall. Finally, she looked up at the camera with an expression of complete and utter defeat. The woman who had started the interview ready for battle, loaded with talking points and righteous indignation, had been absolutely dismantled. And everyone watching in the studio, in the control room, in millions of homes across America knew it. The cameras finally cut to commercial. But the damage was done. The moment was captured forever, preserved in high definition for anyone who wanted to see what happens when someone tries to attack one of Hollywood's most intense, most prepared performers and discovers too late that they've brought a knife to a gunfight. What started as a routine promotional interview had become something else entirely. A masterclass in how to defend yourself without losing your composure. A demonstration of how to turn an attack back on an attacker. And a reminder that some wounds from history never fully heal no matter how much time passes or how many apologies are offered. The question that lingered after the show ended that dominated social media and news coverage for days afterward was simple. Did Tom Cruise go too far? Or did he simply say what millions of Americans had been thinking for decades but were too polite to voice? Whatever the answer, one thing was absolutely certain.